Alright, so I figured this one would be an interesting addition to this whole remake versus thing, since while we are dealing with sort of a horror kind of theme, there's also, another genre with comedy coming in with both of these. But despite that, and despite, telling the same story, there's something clearly different about both of these, and that being another genre that's in one and not the other. And I think that's pretty clear what that is. But it's not necessarily even just having a musical and a non-musical, but also the whole idea of the remake feeling like a very big production, with like really high production values and a high budget for the kind of movie that it is, compared to this tiny Roger Corman movie that was shot in like 2.5 days. What's really amazing about it is when you look at Roger Corman's movies, and I don't in any way want to undermine Roger Corman at all. I would probably consider myself a huge fan, but the thing is that Roger Corman has so many movies, and the approach that he took has been like he's been constantly influential, as far as whether it be, the way he uses genre or just the really, really low budgets or the people that he discovered and put on the map. It's all the creativity and the fun that goes into them. We talked before when we were talking about the Blob about the movies kind of that era that were like really low budget, and some of them could be sort of really forgettable. And that's when you look at just how many movies Corman has. Yeah, a lot of them are just going to be forgettable just based on math, not even necessarily him as like a producer or a director or whatever. And dealing in that sort of B territory where you could say there's only so many ideas, but if there was an idea to do with like the monster genre or the sci-fi genre or the horror genre or whatever, or even beyond that, sometimes action even, he was able to find it. And so going through all of that, you come across a movie about a talking man-eating plant. And kind of how amazing it is, just to put that on the table by itself, how like fun the concept is and the story is, and how it kind of took this really tongue-in-cheek approach, like his movies often did, and just really embraced like the absurd, but also like the dark, and somehow combined them into this very odd sort of black comedy that stands out in this way, that you could almost kind of throw into that monster movie genre of the era also. But the thing that's really amazing is take into account, Corman's reputation of having all these movies that went into all these different things, and then this one just kind of being another one of those. Because it seems, you would think it would stand out, but when you look at Corman's filmography, it's like, yeah, there's some crazy shit in there, and some crazy things that came to life and attacked humans. And that this just kind of belongs maybe in that sort of long list. But of all the things, it was the talking man-eating plant one that was plucked out of this list and somehow turned into a musical. And obviously as things go on and more things get adapted, and like it does get to a point where it seems like even the most, sometimes the most offbeat things and the things that seem least likely to get a musical treatment can sometimes turn into the best ones, as we see here as one example. But it's the idea of something, as somebody that's not really musically inclined or anything like that, it's always interesting to me just in general, music and how music comes to be. Notes and stuff like that that are all put together, and you can imagine, oh, yeah, this kind of sounds like that thing, or that kind of sounds like that thing, but overall ends up becoming an original thing. And it's like the fact that there's so much music in the world, and notes just by themselves are so singular, it's kind of insane to me when you really break it down how music is made, and how many different songs already exist, and then can exist after this, and how it's just endless and endless and endless. And it's like, to take this concept, to be able to see a movie from 1960, just this, B movie that may have pretty much been off the map if not for the fact that, like, one actor in particular had kind of become the face of it despite having, like, 2 minutes of screen time, But other than that, it just kind of not really being that much of a standout thing in its director's lineup, and being able to put music to it and say that's how we can tell this story. How people get inspired like that is something that is completely beyond me and probably forever will be. Not to completely abandon talking about Corman's movie real quick, but just to mention everything that went into like the music of this, whether it be Alan Menken and Howard Ashman, Ashman also wrote the screenplay, obviously, and the way they came up with this musical that was, I think, maybe 6 years before the movie, but still going into that and then going into Bob Gaudio, the music producer, and I guess you can even throw in Miles Goodman, the composer, just like the original score composer for the movie, and bringing all this to life. Not to mention the movie's secret weapon, which is Tanisha Arnold, Michelle Weeks, and Tisha Campbell, who kind of just come in and out of the movie. They're kind of basically there the whole time, and they're also kind of like the blood in the movie's veins as it goes on throughout it, and just the way the music brings this story to life in a way is because they've made, changes to the story itself between the movie and then the 86 movie and the show. Turning this story into a musical is just one thing. That's an accomplishment in itself. But it's the fact that these songs and the music are above and beyond, like, great. Like, it could have been, like, taking an idea and, like, oh, we could probably turn this into a musical, and, like, making something that's, like, surprisingly good. But I feel like surprisingly good is pretty much the last way to describe the musical A Little Shop of Horrors. It is, like, it kind of feels like it's on another level. And that's insane. Where it's like, you just see the concept and you're like, at best, it could be surprisingly good. And that it ends up being so much more than that is... I still can't even really wrap my head around that. But like just kind of taking all the songs in general, where you have the opening song, of course, but then you also have Skid Row pretty much right after it. And it's like in the first 10 minutes, you have these two amazing songs and pretty much all of our character introductions, our main character introductions. And the way Skid Row is just power right out of the gate. And like I said, this is something that's toying with comedy and horror. But to come out with a song that makes the setting just feel so powerful, and the way that it sets the surroundings of the characters that we're dealing with here. Like when the older woman's like coming up the alley and she's the starting point, and it's like just right then, it just feels like the music is something else entirely. But then again, even when it starts, even when we just get the opening of the main song right before the narration starts about something coming from space, and we're just getting the opening credits, it feels like, oh, this is something else entirely. And it's like, it's another level. And that's, like I said, and get all of that in like the first 10 minutes before it even really takes off. Because we don't even really have a plot kick in until Christopher Guest comes in. Anything before that just kind of feels like it's setting everything up, the characters and the setting and all that. And it's, if you want to talk about getting hooked right away, this is pretty much how you do that. And then as it goes, and like even when you look at the performance of Skid Row, where you have like all these background players kind of get their close up, and that kind of sets up the whole thing of, you see these who would otherwise be background players giving the performance of their life with like one close up, and to just establish things with that. And you could just kind of go on, and then the way what I really think the movie does well, especially, is that it seems to set its characters up in one way when we just see them in their normal setting. Where obviously Seymour is Rick Moranis, and he's obviously going to be really timid and kind of rejected. And like we have the moments when Audrey's talking about, Oren indirectly, and talking about how he's the only man that she could get, while Seymour's standing right there, and then it's this 1-2 punch of rejection right after that, and then Audrey leaves. There's the moment where he's left alone with Moshnik, and it's like, well, are we still going to do the plant even though we don't have Audrey? And then he gets rejected again. And it's like, no, you have to care for the plant. And it's like, this is just Seymour's life, essentially. And then when we see him, and he's getting, kind of drained, not just emotionally, but like actually physically once he starts feeding Audrey to his blood. But there's still, I feel like just nothing says Seymour like that shot when the flower shop's really busy and he's just like against the wall, just like looking really dejected. And we have Audrey, our human Audrey, who kind of just seems like, this dumb blonde stereotype or something, and she's obviously, right away we see that she's being abused by somebody long before we've met Oren, because she has, the bruises and the black eye and all that, and she talks so nonchalantly about their relationship and how abusive it is because of his sadistic tendencies. And they somehow turn these into comedic lines, like because she has such the perfect timing. Where it's like the line about Epsom salts and ace bandages and how she could save her money on it now is so tragic and funny at the same time, and how they're able to balance that without it feeling too, like, we can laugh without feeling too like the movie's going too far with it. There's also the moments like when he just the tiny things when he says he's named the plant after her and she does like that squeaking sound. And it's like the way, to my understanding, Ellen Greene also originated the role on the stage, if I remember correctly. The thing I was getting at the start of this, talking about how the musical portion of it utilizes the character work and the other way around, is how we do get the sense that these characters are like kind of small and sort of within themselves, but then you kind of see their real personalities, like the personalities that they hide, sort of come out in the music. Like I said, like when we get the moment when Seymour's singing Skid Row and talks about where depression is just status quo. That lyric and the way that he sings that feels so much like we're seeing what Seymour feels like inside, but how that's never quite able to get out when he's in his sort of normal environment. And we only kind of see the inner workings of these characters through the music. And obviously we get a lot of that with Audrey and all of her sort of fantasies about, like with Somewhere That's Green and stuff like that, where we get a look at how she's really feeling and suddenly Seymour and stuff like that. And it's... I feel like that just kind of utilizes the musical style so well in actually really building characters, because characters are kind of something that feels like it's a bit missing here. Like, Jackie Joseph and Mel Wells obviously can do great stuff here also, particularly Wells when he's doing, like I've always loved the moment in the restaurant when he's like rattling off all the alcohol and stuff like that. And the way he's able to play the overbearing boss, but also in this way that, like, feels unique and offbeat in the way that this whole story is supposed to, and kind of fits that vibe rather than just it being a typical character type. And you can say the same thing about Gardenia also, but I guess this is one case where I feel like I mean, I like Gardenia in this movie, but I do feel like Wells kind of makes the character of Mushnick stand out a bit more, which is like kind of the one place where I feel like the original movie stands out as far as characters go. But then you also have where it's balancing this whole idea of, bringing characters in and out, and the idea of also balancing, like, the campiness of it and the borderline parody of it, like when we have Christopher Guest come in, and he's doing this very over-the-top customer, where it's, like, so intentionally, like, stiff, but also, like, oddly emotive. Like, bizarrely emotive. Candy's doing his thing, where he's, like, got that perfect sort of radio and announcer voice. Like, it reminds me of how great he was in his uncredited part in Rookie of the Year, and how he was able to, like, has those little moments also where, like, he's really into the show and is really kind of keeping things moving, but he also has, like, the patience to keep reminding Seymour to use the microphone, or, like, lean into the microphone, and stuff like that. And there's the whole Murray thing, but I actually want to get into Murray a little bit later, but the way they're able to put these characters together and sort of tie them together in this really cohesive way, because in the original movie it does feel like there's people that are kind of all over the place. And we do meet these really, offbeat characters that really stand out. Like, we do meet the dentist very early, Dr. Farb in this instance. There's Dick Miller, who's, always comes to the shop because he eats flowers and always has like salt and pepper shakers with him, and it's just and I like the fact that they were able to both movies are able to have these offbeat characters without them really repeating much, because it is interesting that they go by different names, because even Dr. Favre and Orin Scrivello feel like very different characters, even though they're both the sadistic dentist character. Their approaches feel significantly different. Um, but now that we've had all these introductions, you would think with the cameos that are going on in the remake that the characters would kind of be all over the place, and it does kind of feel like it's hard to piece them together in the original movie because they're sort of all over the place, and it's like, oh, how is Seymour going to end up at the dentist? Oh, he just happens to have a toothache, and the dentist is pissed that like his flower order got messed up or something. And it's like there's that whole thing, and there's not even the connection between the dentist and Audrey in the original movie. So, like, to take these, where you have, this array of cameos, like, John Candy and Steve Martin, essentially, and Bill Murray and all that, and it's like being able to really, it feels like they're all getting their individual moments. Like the movie might as well be a series of events that are completely unconnected, except for the fact that here's where John Candy gets to have his moment, here's where Bill Murray gets to have his, and so on. But like the way they actually tie the characters all together, where they all have a purpose in the story, but still feel like the movie's almost detouring for them to kind of take the stage. In this, it makes sense that it has this sort of theatrical feel to it. I'm kind of talking about the theatricality of it and the way they use the music when we get the very brief number that's just a little bit of exposition about how Seymour found Audrey 2. And I love this moment also especially. Honestly, as simple as it is and as fleeting as it is, it might be one of my favorite moments in the movie because, like I said, it's the best way possible to do exposition, because it's just sort of telling us, the backstory, very simple, very quick and easy to tell backstory, but everything is in such this theatrical way, the way everybody's moving and the way, the singers come back into it and all of that. And it's like just even it really takes that musical approach, and why musicals have worked for so long, where it's like you take the mundane and you just make them so sort of fantastical and so big and memorable. And that's and that's not to say that you can still tell this story in a very sort of condensed way in the way that the original movie did, because the original movie's sense of humor is really is kind of the blood and veins of it. Where it's like, while both movies are a comedy, I also like the fact that their approaches to humor are more or less pretty different. Like, I can't really recall there being like the same joke being from one to the other, with the exception of like a sadistic dentist and stuff like that. But here you have, and usually they're just lines, like talking about establishing the character of Seymour, like we've talked a lot about with the Moranis incarnation. Here we have Seymour so passive, and the way they portray this is when he first starts feeding Audrey 2. And it's like, this is when he comes to the conclusion that this is a plant that feeds on blood, and his response is simply no accounting for people's tastes. And it's like, and like compare that to Mushnick's more perceptive take, I guess you could say, where he says that Audrey Jr. in this case is growing like a cold sore from the lip. And it's like, even though Mushnick is still blinded by greed and sort of wanting to use this for fame, it does seem like he sort of inadvertently kind of saw through and saw that this was a little uglier of a situation than everybody else seemed to think it was at first. And it's also some of the just some jokes that just really, really work in this really clever and sort of not quite slapsticky, but like just kind of above that, where it's like you have the moment when the guy dies on the train track, and then he's trying to figure out where to put this guy's remains that he's just stuffed into a bag, because even though he didn't really murder this person, he feels responsible enough that he's trying to get away with like hiding this person's body. So getting the idea to hide the body in these certain places, and then the final punchline being that there's a hearse there, and it's like, oh, what more perfect place to hide a dead body than a hearse, even though it's chopped up and put into a bag. Still, and then sure enough, it's a hearse that's already occupied. And it's like, that joke is just so perfect for this moment. And then obviously, to take that into, oh yes, of course, it occurs to him after the fact. Oh yeah, I just happen to have a plant that is man-eating and feeds on blood. Of course, how convenient. And it's like, just the absurdity of that is the kind of humor that this movie really thrives on. And it's like I said, that comes through also, but at the same time, it still feels like the senses of humor in the two movies are somehow just a little different enough to where the jokes never really repeat, but they have the same sort of spirit, which I really love. So, and the idea of like when he goes to the dentist and they have like this really absurd fight, and it's like just the way it really embraces the absurdity. I think the only time I have trouble getting behind the absurdity, and it's maybe because I'm so all about the way they conceived the story and adapted the story for the musical. But the idea of like it getting to a point to where Seymour is hypnotized by Audrey Jr. To kind of kill for him. And it's like it's. I think it's much more interesting when we see Seymour kind of having to make the choices himself and kind of go down a dark path. Where it was just kind of a domino effect of how he got there through the choices that he made. After being treated the way that he was, and kind of seeing this arc of where he has to go to these dark places to kind of get that fame and hopefully get Audrey and all that, to where he pretty much stays an innocent character as far as the musical goes, because it is like, as far as the musical goes, I don't believe he ever actually kills anybody. It's always those sort of situational kind of things. I guess you could say he's pretty responsible for emotionally getting eaten, but it's still, like I said, you can go on the technicality that he never actually kills anybody himself. But speaking of the people whose deaths that we ultimately get to, I do want to talk about Steve Martin specifically, because while I actually think, and this was a steep year for performances, but I would have given Steve Martin probably all the awards for this, and I'm not even exaggerating. And I don't. It's not necessarily just because you've never really seen him play a part like this before this, or really after this. I mean, if you look at the movie Novocaine, it does seem like darkness follows anytime he plays a dentist. But as far as the role itself, where usually what comes up when I talk about Steve Martin is the fact that nobody can imitate him ever. And like you do have this whole thing where once he was sort of in this, I've heard that I don't know too much about the musical itself or its history or anything like that, but I have heard that it's kind of a thing where once the movie came into existence, it was like anybody that played Orin Scrivello on the stage, rather than making the part their own, because this can be seen typically as a mistake when you have a part that's supposed to be kind of you putting your stamp on it. It started to become a thing that when people play Orin Scrivello on stage, they're basically just doing Steve Martin's version of it. And it's, well, you can say that's kind of a bad thing because actors need to put their stamp on it. I also feel like it's definitely telling of what Martin did with this role, to where it's like even experienced actors could say, "I don't know if you can do it better than that." So so it should just pretty much stick to that. And I honestly think it's probably my favorite performances of it. One of my favorite performances of his, if not my favorite performance of his. Which is interesting, not just because he has such a vast career, but because the part is so small. He has, 3 scenes? There's his introduction scene, there's the scene where he meets Seymour, and then there's the big scene in the office. That's the Bill Murray scene that kind of bleeds into him accidentally killing himself while being confronted by Seymour. And that's it. And somehow he just completely left his mark on this movie entirely. It's even him and Audrey that are pictured within the case. So, looking at that, and just this performance of Dentist, which is probably my favorite song in here, but it is one of those cases where it's kind of hard to pick one when they all work in a really big way. But the way this character interacts, it sort of completely changes the vibe of everything. Where it's like, it kind of feels like, despite the fact that Audrey 2 is really our villain and is, a blood-sucking, man-eating plant, that it's the introduction of Warren Scrivello that kind of starts to bring the darkness into the story. And the fact that it's done so comedically, though, because Steve Martin is a genius in the way that he can do the things that he does and do the comedy the way in which he does it. To where, like, when he's just interacting, when he's not in song, like when he first sees Audrey 2 and he says, nice plant, it's big. If that was any other actor, you would think, what the hell performance is this? Like, what in God's name is this person doing? What is this person thinking? But because we know that Steve Martin knows exactly what he's doing, it all makes perfect sense for the character. The way it shows the character, like, the way we set up in the song his really sadistic nature, but then the second time we see him, it's like he's a complete idiot otherwise. In this sort of brute of a character, which is not something you would think of Steve Martin for. Like, you would think, like, go back to 1986 when this is first coming out, you would just think there would be a lot of criticisms about him being miscast, but you didn't hear that. All you heard was that he was stealing the movie. And that's, like, it's almost hard to describe, because like I said, you can't, it's very hard to put into words what makes Steve Martin brilliant, because he's such an original. Bringing that to a character like this just seems so like it should be mismatched, and then it's just so perfect. Much like we were talking about with the story itself and making it a musical. Taking these things that seem totally mismatched and bringing them together just keeps working for this. Keeps working for this whole story in general and doing a musical adaptation of it. And the fact that we have this moment also where, he puts on this mask and he's putting the gas into himself. And we've already set up his relationship with the gas. We set it up in the song. Then we set up the idea of you can just hear his maniacal laughter long in the distance before he even appears. And then this moment here. And by the time we get to this moment in the movie, when he has the mask and he's going full sort of almost horror movie character, is when this movie goes from the absurd to the surreal. Like, when you see the dentist scene in the original movie, it seems like it kind of stops at the absurd, and I love the transition from the absurd into the surreal that this scene takes. And this was already led into us with the Bill Murray scene. And the thing about it is, obviously we kind of mentioned briefly Jack being in the original movie, and the character breaking out enough so much so that I would say they always talk about Easy Rider being the breakout for Jack, which is obviously true. But I almost like to think when he was sitting in the waiting room, flipping through the Pain magazine and reading out of it, is one thing. And I like the way that he's sort of like, even though you get the idea that he's in this waiting room and then he gets called in, that he's going to have this appointment, he's going to leave. But you'll notice when he leaves the Pain magazine, he like carefully lays it face down like he's marking his place, like he knows he's going to come back to it. And so, like, and I'd read somewhere where Nicholson was saying how, like, he had no idea what to do with this character, so in his words, he said, I just did some weird shit I thought might be funny. And that's kind of the vibe you get, but it also feels like this was, it seems like it was very carefully planned, and it's almost this happy accident that it was Jack just kind of fucking around and hoping that it would land. Because I feel like I said, we talked about Easy Rider and how that was Jack's, big breakout. People say that was his star-making turn, but I almost think him sitting in the chair and saying, no Novocaine, it dulls the senses, was when Jack Nicholson, on screen as we know him, was really born. And then he was just kind of able to sort of take that in another direction, take that, craziness in another direction, when Easy Rider gave him something, kind of iconic to do with it. What was it, 6 years later? No, 9 years later. And so, that's, again, looking at that, and the way that scene stands out, there is something where, like I said, I feel like the musical adaptation took the ideas of the original movie and expanded on them and connected them more to make them even better. Because, like I said, I don't want to undermine the foundation that the 1960 movie is setting and that Corman is setting. But here's the thing, is the brilliance about this is that we have a sadistic dentist and a masochistic patient in the same story, but they don't really have a moment together in the original movie. By then, the death of the dentist has already happened. The accidental death of the dentist has already happened, and Seymour is kind of posing as a dentist, and then he has the scene with Jack. So to take the idea and say, what are we thinking here? Why don't we have the sadistic dentist and the masochistic patient in the same scene, like both getting what they want at the same time? And it's like then you have the idea of casting Bill Murray as this patient, and both Murray and Nicholson do something that I love here, where there's that detail about the characters where they've done this so often and they love this. They're so psyched about being at the dentist that they're like setting things up themselves. Where like Jack like puts his own thing on, and you have Murray like putting the cotton in his mouth and adjusting the lights and all that. But yeah, the idea of having them have the scene together, and the fact that Oren has basically met his match with this patient. Like I love the fact that Oren has a whole song about how insane he is and about how twisted he is, and the fact that this scene ends with Oren saying in disgust, "Goddamn sicko," as Murray leaves, and he's pushing him out the door. And it's like, how could you have missed that opportunity? And it's like, of course these two should meet before the dentist is killed. Of course they should. And it's probably like, I remember, to me, when I first saw it as a kid, it was the scene that really stood out to me. Because I do want to say it's like the standout scene of the movie. And that's the thing also, is talking about the characters and how offbeat they are, and how much they can make a story work, is that, to me, the most memorable scene in the movie has nothing to do with the talking plane. Like, the talking plane is nowhere to be found in it. Obviously, indirectly it has something to do with him, but still, the brilliance of this scene and seeing Martin and Murray in the same scene together, which I don't think ever happened again, and or at least hasn't yet, but that's, I feel like it's really one-sided. I feel like I'm talking so much about the 86 movie and not enough about the 60 movie, and like I said, I don't want to undermine that at all, but it's just the way everything was brought together in this, would seem like a complete mismatch, somehow making this nearly perfect movie and perfect musical, is, yeah, I just can't get enough of it. I really can't. But because one thing that the original movie has that the musical doesn't is the detective characters, where it does kind of start off like, I think Jackie Joseph said something in an interview about how, like, it was originally supposed to be a detective movie, and when she was flying out to make it, she thought she was going to be in a detective movie. And then, like, while she was flying out, they were in the process of rewriting it into what they were planning on being a horror movie. And so it's like, you can actually see the detective movie hiding inside it. And it's like, the story is doing so many different things. Is something else that just really makes it stand out and makes it this really sort of, this thing where you can see that it kind of, you could see why it would stand out to somebody on Corman's long list, to sort of pluck out of it and do something else entirely with, and make it sort of bigger. And you talk about the dark comedy, and like I said, the way that they don't reuse the dark jokes in the musical, they come up with their own. Looking at some of the dark stuff in the 60 movie comes from this detective being very nonchalant, like to the point that you almost have to go back and make sure you heard things properly. Where this detective sits down, and then the guy asks him, hey, how's the wife and how's the kids? And he says, oh, the wife's not bad, but we lost one of the kids. He was playing with matches. Implying that and he says, by the way, yesterday this happened, and he's just so nonchalant about it. And I don't know what's funnier about the fact that he's so nonchalant about, oh, we lost one of the kids yesterday because he liked to play with matches, but the line right before it where he's asked how the wife is doing, and he says, not bad. And it's like the jokes like that, and the way they go by so fleetingly is so perfect also. And it's like the way the way it takes the total darkness of it and almost chooses to ignore it, is what is going to make it even funnier. Just dark humor in general is going to be so much funnier when you do it that way. And these characters are just perfect for that. And it's like, once again, and they fit in with the offbeat characters we've been meeting before, where it's like, every time you meet somebody, it's like, there's just no way this would ever be a real person, and that's the beauty of it. And I feel like that's something they did kind of capture with stuff like Christopher Guest coming in, where it's like this guy is from a completely different planet. Ironic given the circumstances, but yeah. But going into one thing we also haven't talked about is the plant itself. That being the puppet or animatronic or whatever you want to call it, and the way they brought this to life. Because obviously Frank Oz has a lot of experience with puppetry and stuff like that, and Lyle Conway, who and together how they kind of made Audrey 2 come to life in this really insane way where like all the movements and the lips, everything about it looks like it's an actual living creature, and it's pretty insane because not only do you just have to make that look like it's a living breathing creature, but like the speaking and the singing, where it's like I love the details and how like the way the mouth moves. They even get in like the little laughs and little noises in between words. With Levi Stubbs obviously doing iconic stuff here. I did read that Eddie Murphy was the original choice for Audrey 2's voice, and it's like, well, I can see that, and I would love to see an iteration of that. It's like I just kind of can't imagine it without Levi Stubbs' voice. There's just something about how big and broad it is, but also totally mischievous it is. It feels very specific and unique. And like I said, in the way they're able to make this giant plant have this giant personality, to where it doesn't even feel like you would think. One of the things to praise Rick Moranis for, which you should, just in general, but also for this specific thing, where especially during Feed Me, where there's definitely a turning point here, and the way Feed Me escalates. And they're singing at each other. Like it doesn't even really feel like a duet of sorts or singing together. They're like singing at each other. And what you would commend Moranis for is his ability to act off of this plant. But it's almost like talking about the Frank Oz connection when you hear about the way actors interact with the Muppets and how pretty much every actor that's interacted with the Muppets say you forget they're puppets after a minute. Like it happens very quickly. You forget that you're talking to a puppet, and I feel like that's had to have been the same thing here, where Moranis probably easily got into this and easily played off this plant. I would imagine, not just because of how good he is, but also just the detail and the specifics of this giant plant and how they can make it look so. Like, I don't even know. I think it's the lips especially that really stand out to me of how real they look. It's really upsetting and glorious in the at the same time, and perfect. So I think there's only one other thing I really wanted to go into, and it was going to take me a minute, so I was trying to make sure that I had addressed everything. I know this is kind of all over the place, but I just have a lot of passion for the 86 movie that's just all over the place. But talking about the way we have this sort of dark ending to the 60 movie, and the dark ending that the show had, and how the movie was going to go into that. So you'll notice that this is the theatrical version, but the director's cut does exist. I think it was released in 2012. And the 2012 release came with what I like to call the real ending. Because I don't, passionately hate the ending of the theatrical release or anything, where it's like Audrey 2 gets beaten. Because obviously, Audrey Jr. ultimately dies in the very last moments of the 60 movie, along with Seymour, but, as far as, Audrey getting her, vision of the life that she wanted and stuff like that, with that tiny little cliffhanger of there being another plant, is fine. I don't hate it or anything, but I don't consider it the real ending, because not only does it just work in the original ending just works in so many ways, because like we were talking about before, about Seymour going down that dark path, and how, it's sort of, there's, a redemption in it where he and Audrey get the happy ending, and he defeats Audrey 2 and all that, but I mean, the fact that this story, in every other iteration, feels like it was, it's heading to a very dark conclusion, where it's it's inevitable that this ends in death and not just the death of Audrey 2 or Audrey Jr., given whichever one you're watching. But this, the first thing that comes to mind as far as questions is, yeah, test audiences really didn't like the real ending, apparently. Like, I think the way Frank Oz described it was the theater became an icebox. So, the problem here is that this ending, the real ending, is massive. Like, really, really massive. And has that feel to it. And it's like, I honestly cannot imagine being, a money person in the industry and putting that much into your climax and then just scrapping it and changing it completely. That's just so weird to me. And like, yeah, it was like a very large number that said they didn't like the ending. But I mean, and I love the fact that, Oz really committed and said, like, we have to do that ending, and it has, and I love the fact that it was made and it did exist so that we can have the real version of the movie. With that ending, which I think there's like a 20-minute difference in the runtime because of it or something. But the idea of Audrey dying and then Seymour, but in between that there is this moment with the Patrick Martin character, and the thing about it is, in the theatrical version, I feel like you could cut that character out completely. Like, it feels like when you know the real ending and then you go back to the theatrical ending, it feels more like you just watched a time travel movie, and it's like, oh, we saw what could happen, so we better just stop that from happening. It feels like the theatrical ending is literally just trying to stop the real ending from happening and all that. So we bring in the Patrick Martin character just to tell him to fuck off. And you could say, like, oh, it gave Seymour the idea of, oh, I have to stop this before this happens, but I feel like once it's revealed that Audrey 2 is from space is where that comes in. Where Seymour could say, oh, I gotta stop before this escalates. So, that's not even to mention the fact that they brought in Jim Belushi, who just sucks the air out of everything. And the fact that you had to replace Paul Dooley, of all people, with Jim Belushi, if you want to talk about a massive downgrade, because not only is just, Jim Belushi bring nothing to this, and but even that, the character really shouldn't even be here in the theatrical version. You could just cut him out completely. I love the way Paul Dooley appears and plays the character, where it feels like, it gave me the idea that Paul Dooley could have played like the devil or something at this time, where it feels like he's like the devil on Seymour's shoulder here and really has that vibe of like he's, doing a Faust kind of thing here with him, and I love the way that scene plays out, and the fact that it does end up leading to the chaos in the final moments, and it serves a purpose. And in between, we have the moment where he so cold-bloodedly eats Seymour and spits his glasses out. And it's like, I can get it to where audiences weren't really into it, but like I said, when it just goes completely and totally off the rails crazy, and just the total and complete destruction, and that shot of Audrey 2 taking over the Statue of Liberty and cackling and then breaking through the screen. How could anybody not have seen how fucking perfect that ending is? It's so, and that's the thing too. Let me stop right here and say immediately, I am not that guy. I am not the guy that says, oh, darker endings are always better, and everything needs a darker ending, and happy endings suck. Happy endings are too sweet, or whatever. I am not that guy at all. Like, if you have a happy... Like, when you have a happy ending, and you have people say, like, oh, it would have been better if this dark thing happened, I'll be the first person to say, fuck off. No, not everything needs to be dark and bleak and stuff like that. I said, if anything, like, maybe half the time, I'm anti... bleak endings, since I feel like we got to a point where bleak endings were actually starting to get played out, and like too many movies had bleak endings, and it's like happy endings almost needed to make a comeback at some point. But no, with all that said, I am 100% all in on the director's cut ending being the real movie, which I unfortunately cannot display right now because anywhere I've looked it costs an arm and a leg, so there is that. It also eats away at me that when I met Paul Dooley, I would have loved to have asked him how he felt about his scene being restored and the original ending being restored. But the trouble is that I met him in 2012, so like it was like right before the director's cut was put out that I met him, so I never got the chance to ask about that. But that's like the first thing I would if I got that opportunity again. Not, like it kind of eats away at me that I just missed that cutoff to bring that up. But yeah, so I don't really know what else there is to say. Like I said, this was clearly all over the place, but that's how I feel about this. Those are my very messy feelings on these. So clearly there's one I prefer, but like I said, I do respect this one for being the foundation, and just in general the foundation that Corman has been for, like I said, so many people that we know now, and just, you know, genre movies and B movies and stuff like that. Obviously his contributions are just massive and massive and massive all the way through, so that's where we are. But like I said, the whole adapting it into a musical, but not just accomplishing that task in itself, but making a great musical where like every song stands out. And the one that they added, Mean Green Mother from Outer Space, the one that got the Oscar nomination, the first time a song with profanity and it got nominated. And I think I also read it was the first song sung by a villain that got nominated, which is pretty insane. So yeah, this, I can't say enough good things about it. I don't know how many times I've seen it at this point, but there will be many, many more. But like I said, if you can manage to see it with the real ending, try to stick to that if you can. So that's, I think, where I can leave this. So we're still catching up and doing all these other verses, and then we'll be finishing out October in the next 10 days or so, after we go into Stephen King series here and there, and another franchise video, and another awards video, and all the other stuff that'll be coming soon. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.